Wow, here we are. This is going to be a very, very long video. Hey, but we're here for it, right? We prepared for this. This is, whew. Hey, Slater here, and here are my thoughts on the latest Kendrick Lamar album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. I have a lot of notes I've been taking just from ideas that I didn't want to lose or from conversations with friends that I didn't want to forget, so excuse me if I look over here off screen to recite my notes and script verbatim because there are some things I want to specifically choose my words carefully and intentionally for. Hi, this is Editor Slater. I just changed my hair up, I doubled up my locks, but you're probably going to see me in the video a couple times too. Just a couple of notes or a couple of things I might want to add. There's a lot going into this album outside of the music before I even get to that, and quite frankly that's been one of the more exciting parts of this album release for me. Talking to other people, seeing their opinions, and having these conversations of the topics that are brought up on the album. I love art that makes me think, challenges me, and stirs up a good conversation, and this album does exactly that. This album is completely different from anything Kendrick has done in his discography. Why? Well, there are a myriad of reasons, but mainly because this album shows a new side or vulnerability to Kendrick that we've never gotten on any of his other albums. He's always been able to express his inner emotions and thoughts, whether it be about his adolescence on a project like Good Kid, Mad City, highlighting societal issues and how it affects him in communities that he's either a part of or loves deeply on a project like Section 80 or To Pimp a Butterfly, or on the album where several tracks are titled Human Emotions on Damn. I knew Kendrick could do something different or could give us something like this because he's that talented of an artist, but I didn't think he actually would give us something like this. You know, talk this openly about his family in ways that he's never done before, talk about his children, his longtime partner who's all over this album, talk about himself and his faults and his hypocrisy. Kendrick has always rapped from the perspective of the protagonist in a lot of the stories and a lot of the experiences he talks about, which makes sense since he's telling the story. I mean, when you look at his second album and perhaps his most popular or most iconic, the album is titled Good Kid, Mad City. So Kendrick always has this perspective and he always has this viewpoint that he's just a good kid surrounded by terrible circumstances and he's telling you the stories of those circumstances. But him, he's just an angel, saint-like figure who would never, do anything wrong or commit any acts of fault or flaw, even though he said plenty of things that should probably make people think otherwise. So when he actually rips the band-aid off and visits therapy to unpack the person he is under that figurative role on this album, it's ugly. It shouldn't come as a surprise though. Kendrick has never been the good guy. He's also never been the bad guy, but he's always just been a human just telling us his experiences through his art. I said it after my first listen and I still believe it now. This is a black therapy album. So much so that on the intro, Kendrick admits after all this time and about all this grief he's been going through over the past almost 2,000 days, he sought out a therapist. And on the first disc of this album, he goes through many topics that most would talk about during therapy. Often more surface level stuff, but still very important things that need to be talked about. But later on the second disc, that's where the heavier sessions happen. And as said on the 10th track, session number 10, that's where the breakthrough starts to occur. One of the points I wanted to address and talk about was one of the points I saw Sean C bring up, and the effect that a lot of black artists are just out there selling trauma for entertainment. And that's become a more popular thing amongst a lot of artists, specifically black artists. And reflecting on this year and thinking about some of my favorite artists and some of my favorite albums, a lot of my favorite pieces of music come from black artists who are talking about their trauma and opening up and talking about their experiences. Artists like Earl Sweatshirt, Saba, Denzel Curry, and now Kendrick Lamar. I think typically most people would agree that being vulnerable and showing people that side of you is a positive and shows how strong a person can be. And I think most would say art that's more vulnerable and personal would tend to be better than art that's more surface level or more ambiguous to uphold a fantasy. I'm not sure though if the majority of audiences realize how much of a toll it can be for someone to do that kind of outpouring into their artistic projects. For some it could be therapeutic and it helps them, sure. But for some it could really be a burden, especially if that's the expectation or that's the bar set for whether something is good music or good art. Take this quote from Frank Ocean on this topic from an interview back in 2019. He says, "I believe for a very long time that there is strength in vulnerability, and I don't really believe in that anymore. Strength and vulnerability sound opposite as words, and so to combine them sounds wise, but I don't know if it is wise. It's just this realization that hit me. Oh right, it's a choice whether you will be truthful or a liar." Frank Ocean continues by saying, "The expectation for artists to be vulnerable and truthful is a lot, when it's no longer a choice. Like, in order for me to satisfy expectation, there needs to be an outpouring of my heart or my experiences in a very truthful, vulnerable way." Frank then says, "I'm more interested in lies than that. Like, give me a full motion picture fantasy." And then the interviewer asks Frank Ocean if there's a difference between a fantasy and a lie, and he smiles and says they're the same thing. So whether you enjoy this Kendrick Lamar project or not, I think we all just need to appreciate how much went into a project like this and what it took for him to put this all on wax, all on an album. As he says on the opening track, "I've been going through something, 1,855 days. Be afraid." Another aspect that this album touches on that I think is important to discuss is the idea of celebrity culture. One of the theories sometimes I believe in and I'm constantly seeing in my life is that the more you get to know someone, typically the less you like them. For example, take some famous musicians like Kodak Black, who's on the album, Kanye West or Ye, and Drake, versus artists like The Weeknd, Bruno Mars, or Frank Ocean. All of these artists make different music, so that's not the comparison I'm making. But I'm sure if you were to go around asking people their opinions on these artists as celebrities, they would be more favorable towards the second trio more so than the first trio. And I believe that's because we don't know as much about an artist like Frank Ocean. With an artist like Kanye, we're constantly seeing him in the headlines, he's constantly having public moments by his own volition and bringing audiences into his personal life, whereas Frank Ocean seems to intentionally avoid the spotlight, and only few images and videos of Frank Ocean even exist. I mean, this guy Frank Ocean could literally just be in a video walking down the street and some of his fans would be like, oh my god, I'm so proud of him, he got outside today, he's smiling, look at him, he's breathing air. And I believe Kendrick Lamar has been deified in the same way. I would assume most people don't know that much about Kendrick as much as an artist like a Kodak Black, Drake, or a Ye. I'm sure most people didn't even know he had a longtime partner or that he even had children before the release of this album. So when he opens up his world and lets you take a look in, I don't think we should be so quick to say Kendrick is this godlike figure or Kendrick is the worst person on earth. Kendrick Lamar, just like all of those other artists I mentioned earlier, he is human. He does good things and he does bad things. He's a human that creates art that many people like to enjoy because he's very good at it. So don't be surprised if you hear that he still bumps R. Kelly songs, or at one point he thought real men didn't need therapy and those who did were soft, or everything that goes on with this album. He's human and humans aren't perfectly curated without flaws. Of course, you could still talk about whether you like something or someone based upon your own perspective, but this isn't about meeting the hero, it's about meeting the person behind him. One of the things I love talking about in music is seeing an artist develop and change over time, and certain themes that artists still keep intact after all that time. And for Kendrick, there are two particular things that I've noticed for a long time in his music. The dichotomy of love versus lust detailed verbatim on his album Damn. You also have other instances with this on Damn with Wickedness versus Weakness, Halle Berry versus Hallelujah on Good Kid Mad City, and on To Pimp a Butterfly, the difference between being pimped out for the industry versus staying true to yourself and blossoming into a butterfly. One of the themes I've seen in this album that I've seen in other examples in Kendrick music is the idea of what a real man is. On Kendrick's last album, Damn, he mentions being diagnosed with real nigga conditions, and also talks about that on DNA, where he says sex, money, murder is in his supposed DNA as a rapper. But we also hear a song like Real from Good Kid Mad City where Kendrick has his dad on, and his dad talks about what a real man is, saying taking care of responsibilities, taking care of your family, and God is real, and following God is something that a real stand-up man should do. Here on this album, we hear Kendrick struggling as a black man dealing with how authentic and how real of a person he is. Some of that comes from trauma and lessons he's been taught since he was young, but he's working hard to overcome them and be a better person as he ages into his 30s. If I had to describe what this album says a real man or a real nigga is, I'd say it's someone who grows and learns. Someone who grows to be more emotionally intelligent, more self-aware, someone who grows to understand the perspectives and feelings of others, and someone who's willing to talk about or express it all. The track that I assume most people are talking about or will talk about is Auntie Diaries, a track in which Kendrick details the story of two of his family members transitioning, and how that affected a young Kendrick and the community around him and his family. Most people understand what this song is about. It isn't very hard to understand what Kendrick is trying to say on the song. A tale about how he was once taught certain things but later came to appreciate people for who they are and chose humanity over religion. Most people are having conversations though about how the song was executed. Kendrick says the F slur about 10 times in this song. A callback to when he was in elementary school and it was funny to call people that because he didn't know any better. Also a time he recalls where other kids were saying it and he started to realize it really wasn't that funny as much as it was hurtful to the people they were saying it to. And later on he says F-bomb and apologizes for the fact that he didn't know any better because at the time he thought words were just words unless there was action and intent behind them. But finally, at the end of the song, Kendrick's cousin brings up his hypocrisy, saying that can only be true if Kendrick lets a white girl say nigga. He's referencing a time where Kendrick was on tour and he was doing a show in Alabama. He would sometimes let fans come up on the stage, and this time he let a white girl on stage and she wanted to rap his song, Mad City. When she performed the song, she said the N-word as Kendrick raps it in his lyrics, and Kendrick and the DJ stopped the song and said, wait, you can rap the song, but you just have to censor one word though. He tried laughing off the awkward moment and asking the crowd if she should still perform, but I think the crowd was against it, and eventually I assume she made her way back to her seat. Kendrick is saying it's weird to be upset at a white girl saying the N-word during a rap song or just in general, but then also be okay with saying an F-slur that's offensive to the entire LGBT plus community. I think the song was supposed to be a big moment in hip-hop since Kendrick is one of the biggest and one of the best, or if not the biggest and the best rappers in the game, but I'm not sure how far this message will actually go. People are reasonably upset with the execution of the song, and although I'm not seeing a lot of people saying Kendrick is homophobic or transphobic, they're upset that such a talented, creative songwriter and artist can't go about making this point on the song without saying the F slur. So rather than us having a conversation about dealing with and hopefully moving past the homophobia and transphobia in hip-hop, we're having discussions about the execution of the song. It's unfortunate, but again, I understand why people are upset and they're entitled to their feelings and their beliefs about the song. And I'm not a person or a resource who can authorize who can and can't say that word. That call is not up to me. I think instead you should seek out and listen to the people who are part of that community. Don't go up to them and ask them to represent all of the community by demanding answers from them, but just listen to what people have to say in those conversations that are being had and try to learn something. When it comes to Auntie Diaries, I just wanted to add that I don't think it's a complete failure, and I still think it is a very powerful song, a powerful moment, and just a powerful song to listen to. And of course, there's going to be a lot of black, male, cishet Kendrick listeners, including myself, who are learning a lot during these conversations that are being held. So, but there's also going to be a lot of people getting mad at the response of the song, saying, why are you angry at Kendrick? He's trying. Shouldn't that be enough? Just the fact that he's not a homophobe and a transphobe, and that's a problem. For other topics on this album and other reaction points, I'm not sure what it'll look like. Mental health, domestic abuse/violence, generational trauma, addiction. These are all topics that would greatly benefit several people in several communities, if productive conversations were had and the appropriate resources and continuous attention stayed with them. The only problem is, it's hard to talk about these things. It's hard to talk about it if you haven't lived through these things or know somebody who has. It's hard to talk about it if you don't have the power to move things forward and change things immediately. And it's hard to get other people to participate in these conversations. I think this album will ultimately help start and generate some of those conversations. But similar to an album like To Pimp a Butterfly, I think it'll take people some time to really unpack and open up to all of the things that Kendrick is discussing on this album. Not saying that people are hating on this album now and they're going to turn around and feel different about it in a couple months, because quite honestly, I'm sick of that narrative being placed onto every single album that releases. But rather what I'm saying is, when an artist puts 1,855 days into an album, perhaps in this microwave culture of music that we're in right now, maybe we should, I don't know, take our time with this one and really just let it sit and simmer with us as we think about these things. And then we'll see how we really feel in a matter of weeks, months, or even years for some people. Some people listened to this album once and they knew it wasn't for them, and that's okay. And some people listened to this album and they immediately knew that this was their favorite album they've heard all year, or the best album that they've heard all year, and that's okay. I guess I just hope that this album continues to live on and continues to stay on the minds of people, because I think this album is important. Now, let's talk about the music. This album is 2 discs. 2 albums per se. The first set of 9 songs represents the part of the title that is The Big Steppers, and the second set of 9 songs represent the part of the title that is Mr. Morale. The first part of the album I believe to be Kendrick entering therapy and having to discuss and think about a lot of these topics out loud, whereas the second half is him actually confronting these issues and having to solve them in order to move forward. Going into this album, and at the start of this album, we got what I think is really the thesis statement in The Heart Part 5, but also with songs like United in Grief and N95, which I'm about to talk about. United in Grief, this is really about as good as it gets for a Kendrick album intro. He reminds us right off the bat how long it's been since he's released a solo project. He basically details many things throughout the span of his career. At first, he asks several questions and answers them himself to explain his perspective and mental, before admitting during this time he sought out himself a therapist, so he can share his theories, comparisons, and have someone to humble him a little bit. We also hear several voices, including his partner, Whitney Alford, who's all over this album, as she repeats, tell them the truth. Meaning no more stories and perspectives about something that you saw and witnessed or something that you might have been involved with. Let's tell them and let's unpack who you really are. And then we get this insane drum pattern that continues throughout the second half of the song, with these brief piano intermissions where Kendrick stops to tell everyone, I grieve different. In his second verse, he details meeting a woman on one of his tours and talks about several traumas that they both have faced. Kendrick admits that one of the ways he likes to deal with his trauma and deal with his pain is to have sex, before again reminding us that he grieves differently, and this was his way of coping at that time. And then on the last verse, he talks again about how he uses his celebrity status to cope and deal with the pain in his life, but this time he does it with his money. He also details how he watched Baby Keem buy 4 houses in 4 months, and how Dave Free bought a Porsche, so Kendrick feels like he needs to buy a Porsche now, and how family dynamics repeat in this situation. Whether that be the feeling of responsibility where you have to take care of everyone in your family, and if something happens to them, it's on you, or the feeling of you having so much money that you don't know what to do with it, or worse, you don't care what you do with it. They were using their money to wipe their tears away, but quickly realizing it wasn't making the pain or the trauma or anything else go away and erase from their lives. The main takeaway is the refrain that Kendrick keeps repeating on the song, in which he says, I grieve different. And in saying this on the first track, Kendrick is letting us know this is going to be an album where he airs out his grievances in a way that he's never done so before. N95. This is one of the early hits and one of the early fan favorites on the album. It was also the first song to receive a music video for this album. The opening shot being Kendrick watching a kid in a Christ-like position hovering over the ocean ready for crucifixion, which is definitely a theme you'll see all across this album, and you even see it on the album cover as Kendrick is wearing the crown of thorns. With the song referencing the N95 mask, this song has a lot of lyrics where Kendrick is telling people to take off the mask, take off the metaphorical mask that they're wearing. Also starting off the song saying, "You're back outside, but they still lied." Kendrick implies that there's a lot of BS in the world and within himself, and when you take it all off, he says,
"Ugh, you ugly as fuck."
With his second verse, he details almost everything that happened during the 2020 pandemic and all of the political and capitalistic things to follow, calling out some of the bigger entities and their motivations as opposed to helping the people who really needed it during that time. Lastly, on the third verse, Kendrick asks a lot of soul-defining questions amongst all of this chaos. We also have him speaking about his internal fears about the fact that he's such a well-respected celebrity, he feels a responsibility for everything he says. On one hand, I kind of cringe at the idea of famous celebrities feeling like they can be canceled for something that they say, but on the other hand, I put myself in their shoes and I think about what it would be to genuinely feel like if you said the wrong thing, you would have everything taken away from you and never have access to those resources ever again. That could be a scary thought if you genuinely believe that. I think what most celebrities want in this instance is the freedom to do or say whatever they want without any responsibility, without any repercussions, or without an outcry from social media, but that's just not how this works. Worldwide Steppers. This is the first time we hear Kodak Black on the project. He states 3 important characters on the album within himself, Kodak Black, Kendrick Lamar with his alias, OK Llama is what he says. I still don't know if it's OK Lamar or Oklama, but I don't know, I'll just go with OK Llama. No, that sounds dumb. I gotta say Oklama. Oklama sounds the coolest, but OK Lamar sounds correct based off the way that it's spelled. I don't know, man. And Eckhart Tolle. Hold on. Kodak Black.
Kodak Black. OK Llama.
Eckhart Tolle, who is a writer and philosopher, one who's notably worked with Oprah, which is important. Kendrick will reference his ideas and work all across this album as he is the actual therapist who helps Kendrick get through a lot of his issues. Kendrick has a lot of flaws within himself that he addresses on this song. On the first verse, he actually talks about what's been keeping him busy with the past few years with his children, writer's block for 2 years, and dealing with his own issues. Then he starts talking about his sexual relationships and hints at his lustful addiction. And he says this with white women and how that affected him in various situations. His partner Whitney was wondering if he had a problem, and Kendrick said, "I might be racist," as he felt his ancestors watching him as if Kendrick was doing some act of retaliation. In verse 3, Kendrick seems to hold up a mirror to society as he calls out nonprofits, churches, crooks, Hollywood, corporate entities, and mainstream media, while also addressing an issue that happened on an event with TDE while they were serving the community. He feels like the food him and TDE served at the event may have contributed to some deaths in the community by giving people high blood pressure, saying essentially that we all do things to hurt one another, whether it's an immediate attack or a long-term effect. We're all people who cause pain to some degree, is what he says, or at least that's what he implies and how I interpret it. And we're all steppers because we tap dance away from conversations about these things, which is why a song like this would never become the most popular song on this album, because it has a lot of difficult things that it talks about. People don't want to talk about that. Die Hard. On the flip side, this is a summer jam, vibey anthem of a track on this album. So much so that a lot of people already think this is the worst song on the album because it's not as deep as some of the other songs, even though it does have a lot of meaningful conversations. This track sees Kendrick struggling to open himself up fully to his partner for the sake of his relationship. Kendrick also says his past won't keep him from his best, even though subtle mistakes feel like life or death. So in order to get the most out of his relationship, he must open up with his insecurities and faults to move forward. And with some of the things Kendrick has rapped about and some of his opinions and perspectives on things, I don't blame him for the hesitancy. This is a guy who still subconsciously believes in cancel culture could take his whole career away from him forever if he says the wrong thing. So I could see why it's hard for him to open up to someone else and trust that other person. Father Time, another immediate fan favorite and one of the picks that most people say is the best song on the album.
Oh my god, he mentioned Kanye and Drake.
No, but really. At the beginning of the song, we hear Kendrick's partner Whitney telling him, "You really need some therapy." To which Kendrick responds, "Real niggas don't need therapy." To which Kendrick's partner calls him stupid, and Kendrick replies that the whole world is stupid, and his partner recommends that he reaches out to Eckhart, the psychologist and the therapist. The big talking point with the song is Kendrick overcoming his daddy issues, as Kendrick explores how he's dealt with toxic masculinity from other generations and what it means to be a real man. It features a beautiful chorus from Sampha as it details what it was like for Kendrick growing up. Kendrick was taught through tough love, and he was taught to bottle up his emotions and not be a weakling. And he was taught that men were supposed to push through things and worry about feelings later. Kendrick admits that he's egotistical and honestly needs some help with the way that he was raised. Kendrick ends with a message to those with a similar experience to him, saying on the last line, "Till then, let's give the women a break, grown men with daddy issues." And on Rich-Interlude, right after he says, "Let's give women a break," we get this Kodak Black interlude. And I understand Kendrick's motivation for having Kodak on here, but I'm not sure if I can agree that he can have it both ways. I don't want to spoil the big point of the album, but I don't think it's reasonable to be an ally to black women and women in general, while also putting Kodak Black at the forefront, especially if Kodak isn't willing to put in the work to better himself and right his wrongs rather than just saying his past is behind him. As Kodak Black has a lot of involvement on this album, this is a track where it's just him for the entire interlude performing spoken word. hard. It's a rags to riches type of story where Kodak details how a person like him isn't supposed to be in the position that he is now, after all that he's gone through in his life. He's come a long way and now is only 24 years old, I believe, but he's learned a lifetime of lessons. Rich Spirit, which is the song following after. Kendrick talks more about himself and his qualities while he says, "And celebrity do not mean integrity, you fool. I'm a good man, shake your hand, firm grip rule." Once again showing that this is an album humanizing Kendrick and telling everyone not to prop him up too high. We also get those brother flows that Kendrick showed on Family Ties, and we get him discussing more themes about narcissistic tendencies and loyalty and trust. We Cry Together, another standout from this album. Kendrick has always said whenever he writes his bars and he writes his songs, he writes them as film scripts and can see them being played out as visuals as he's writing them. This song is that vision fully realized, in my opinion. Before the song comes out, we hear Whitney saying, "This is what the world looks like," and what follows is one of the most vulgar songs I think I've ever heard. Kendrick and actress Taylor Page play the role of a couple getting into a heated argument, going back and forth over various things. Both are clearly hurting and throwing a lot of insults at one another and calling out seemingly many problematic points that Kendrick would like for these communities to discuss. And near the end of the song, after the argument, we hear the couple falling for each other once again and going on to have sex after the argument. And at the end of the song, we hear repeated footsteps as Whitney tells us, "Stop tap dancing around the conversation." Purple Hearts is the last song on the first disc of the album, and it features powerful performances from Kendrick, Whitney, and Ghostface Killah. The main themes of the song consist of, rather than taking the easy or more lustful and wicked route, to rather shut up and let love guide you. We are all put on this earth to love one another, so as he says in the song, shut the fuck up when you hear love talking. He also says that this is a message coming from God, and Kendrick is playing the role of the plug, giving this message out to everyone. So, as a resolve to the end of this disc, The Big Steppers, it seems the solution Kendrick has learned in this therapy session is to address problematic situations head on and let love lead the way through the voice of God. Count me out. So, on the intro to the Mr. Morale disc, we hear Eckhart the therapist addressing Kendrick as Mr. Duckworth, before we hear Whitney narrating the album again saying Session 10, Breakthrough. It's good to note that this is the 10th song on the album, and this is really a turning point in Kendrick's therapy session throughout the album as he makes several revelations and starts to work towards a solution. This is a song where Kendrick learns, above all else, if he can't trust anyone or anything, he can trust himself, as he's already been through a lot and has seen the other side of several things. All of his worries turn into this character that he calls Miss Regrets, and in order to move forward, he realizes he needs to speak his truths in order to free himself from this. Crown. This is one of the more simple sounding songs on the album, I feel like. This is a song simply dedicated to the idea of Kendrick freeing himself from the expectation of pleasing anyone other than himself. Something that he of course touched on in the previous song. He understands though that this is a responsibility he once wanted, as he states, "Heavy is the head that chose to wear the crown." But after realizing everything that entails, Kendrick no longer wants that crown. Silent Hill. This is a song where on the outside, it seems like just a fun trap song collab between Kodak and Kendrick Lamar. And it pretty much is, but I think the title of the song is very interesting. And the fact that Kendrick talks about silence multiple times and even mentions a hill of silence from his New Thoughts letter on his website from a couple months ago. So I interpreted this as Kendrick finding peace and his hill of silence being his comfort zone in a meditative kind of way. And this is really the start of him working things out and starting to solve things on the album, so you can say hip-hop is healing for him. On the Savior-Interlude, Baby Keem over this production is too good. This song starts off with the theory from Eckhart the therapist that I think is essential to this album, and saying that hurt people will grow up to hurt other people because that's all they know. So we're doomed to commit the same mistakes and pain in a cycle until we learn how to heal. And then Baby Keem raps from his perspective about his upbringing and things that shaped his life before bringing us to where he is now. On Savior, Kendrick opens up by talking about more famous black figures in himself, J. Cole, Future, and LeBron James, saying that all of them give their fans and their listeners something and they have a lot of people that look up to them, but at the end of the day, they can't be their saviors, they can't be their end-all be-all, they can't be these godlike figures that aren't human to these fans. And there's also more tap dancing in this section. Kendrick is in this position where he wants to be known as this prophet that spreads God's messages, something that he talks about in a lot of his music and he talks about on this album. And he wants to be known as the best rapper, likely of all time, something he also states a lot in his music. But he realizes and wants us to realize that he's just a human just like the rest of us. Kendrick has a bar where he states, "Like it when they pro-black, but I'm more Kodak black." And I liken this bar to the idea of people supporting black business, black creators, and black people in general, but only the ones they're comfortable with and the ones who they deem deserve it. But Kendrick tells the audience he's probably more like Kodak Black than you'd even know, which should challenge the listener in saying, would you still support me then? And again, I'm not sure about the execution of this line. I mean, Kodak has had a number of controversies and legal issues in his life and his career, if I'm putting it nicely. He's 24 years old, and I feel like Kodak Black has been a figure since he was like 15 or 16. By Kendrick's logic of what he talks about on this album, perhaps Kodak is a figure of generational trauma and more so a product of his environment, more so than he is just a broken or an evil person at heart. The same logic continues on the catchy chorus where Baby Keem joins in to say, "Are you happy for me?" Kinda similar to Kendrick's line, "When shit hits the fan, are you still a fan?" from To Pimp a Butterfly. Baby Keem asks the people around him, and more importantly the fans, "Are you happy for me, the individual?" It's a really humanizing question because, as Kendrick states at the beginning of the song, although a lot of these figures are very popular, they're very wealthy, they're very good at what they do, in their truest of hearts, they're just like any other person walking on this earth. They experience happy moments in their life, sad moments, they experience trauma, they celebrate success. So rather than looking to them as godly figures, Kendrick wants everyone to be aware of their humanity and root and cheer for them the same way you would root and cheer for your friends and family. The song Auntie Diaries, I already pretty much talked about before I talked about the music on this album, so yeah, I feel like that was all I wanted to say about this song. For the song Mr. Morale, this song starts off where Auntie Diaries ended. This song samples a YouTube video from an American football fan saying it was one of the worst performances I've seen in my life. I couldn't sleep last night because I felt this. And then the song begins. This is where Kendrick addresses his children and the idea of generational trauma and the idea that Kendrick is no longer an individual who can just run out and do everything that he wants. Everything that he does out in the world now, good or bad, has an effect on his family, the people around him, and likely causes generational trauma between his children if he chooses to do the wrong things. He also says he thinks of Robert Kelly, and I think he says his actual first name in an attempt to humanize him and call back to a time where he wasn't a monster who committed several crimes. And Kendrick wonders if he weren't molested when he was young, would he become the monster that he later turned into? He also brings up Oprah and wonders if she ever found closure for the way that she was abused when she was younger. I think the choice of including both of these figures is very intentional. R. Kelly is someone that mostly everyone is universally against because although he held his status as the name and as the king of R&B, I didn't really grow up on R. Kelly, so I can't really speak to his music. From what I know, he was a very popular musician and had a lot of hits and a lot of good songs that people liked. But he also had several legal cases for abusing young women and child pornography before finally being found guilty for sex trafficking in 2021. Oprah, on the other hand, is a pretty likable figure who's overcome her past and has become a billionaire. Both have dealt with an immense amount of trauma, but dealt with it in different ways and have been affected in different ways. Kendrick ends the song with saying how heavy this stuff is, but it's time to heal, and that's the way we need to attempt to move forward after this. The song also includes Eckhart the Therapist once again, who's helping Kendrick throughout this album. Mother I Sober. This is the longest song on the album and perhaps the most personal and vulnerable Kendrick has ever been on a track, leading me to believe this is one of the best songs Kendrick has ever written. If you'll allow me real quick to read what I wrote, Kendrick goes through and details a family history of sexual assault and trauma he's experienced and seen other people experience in his family. He's involved in a situation where one of his family members abuses him, and at first he denies it and tries to get it out of his mind, but his mother doesn't believe him and thinks a family member actually did something heinous. Kendrick then learns that his mother didn't believe Kendrick because she went through a similar thing and denied it herself. Kendrick realizes that when it comes to his addiction, he wasn't addicted to drugs or alcohol, but rather had a lustful addiction which contributed to the problems he talked about earlier on this project. And after his partner suggests that Kendrick goes to therapy, he learns that tragedies and devastation in black families accumulates over time and only gets worse when it's not discussed or it's not handled. It's like this dark spirit or ghost that casts over us and constantly haunts and tortures us in some of our lifestyles and the way we live. Kendrick says, so listen close before you start to pass judgment on how we move, learn how we cope. And lastly, to end this song, Kendrick states that by being open about this and by sharing this with his family, his close ones, and now the world, he set himself free and others free in the hopes that they'll be healed by the love of God and the love of forgiveness. Aiming to break the cycle of pain where hurt and damaged people go out and hurt and damage other people, Kendrick states near the end how he's not only setting himself free, but also setting free his abuser from his mind state and having to constantly worry or stress about that trauma. So obviously this is a very powerful moment in Kendrick's career. At the end of the song, we hear Kendrick's full family on one track for the first time, with his partner saying that Kendrick broke a generational curse, with his children saying, "Thank you, Dad," and Mr. Morale. And now we have the outro, Mirror, which is about as good as it gets when it comes to a Kendrick outro. He reminds us in details how selfish and flawed he can be as a person, even though he still has this saint-like image of a rapper who can do no wrong, artistically and culturally. In this song, we hear several lyrics alluding to the fact that Kendrick cannot be who people think he is or who they want him to be. A king, a god, a savior, etc. He chooses to live selfishly and chooses to pursue entities that please himself and those around him. We also hear several lyrics hinting to the fact that this may be the last Kendrick album for a long time, and that is okay. So after this whirlwind of an album, I don't even know how to talk about this album the same way I talk about other albums. Kendrick Lamar is one of the greatest minds when it comes to crafting albums, especially in hip-hop. We also have a lot of talking about mirrors on this album. Kendrick sort of holds up a mirror to society and exposes a lot of flaws and a lot of faults of other people on the first half of the album. More so on the second half, he holds up the mirror to himself and talks about his flaws. We also just have a lot of lyrical references to mirrors. We have the last track named Mirror, and the track list is mirrored on the album. So the third track on the first half of the album is Worldwide Steppers, and the third from the bottom on the second half of the album is Mr. Morale. And we also see that with the positioning of the interludes. You could pick apart different topics and themes of the other songs as well. Everything is mirrored, and I think that's really cool as a concept. And like I said, although I've been way more intrigued about the actual conversations this album has been stirring out more than the actual album, I still do love this album, and I actually do love a lot of the songs and the way they were produced and executed. This album is cohesive, it means something to me, I understand everything that Kendrick is saying, even though I don't relate to everything that he's saying because I haven't lived the same experience as Kendrick. To me, this album rivals To Pimp a Butterfly as his best album, or at least it means as much to me as To Pimp a Butterfly means to me, if that makes sense. As I've gotten older, albums like Section 80 and Good Kid, Mad City don't really resonate with me as much. Not that those albums aren't as amazing as I thought they were, or that the quality has dropped down. It's just I appreciate so many more things about life and Kendrick's music in general. So I appreciate albums like To Pimp a Butterfly, Damn, and now Mr. Morale and The Big Steppers. And I really connect more emotionally with those later albums. People are going to come at me with pitchforks and torches if I don't rate this album and compare it to his other albums in like an official list. This album sounds as good as Damn quality-wise. This album is as cohesive as Good Kid, Mad City, and I think this album will be, or maybe already is, as important as To Pimp a Butterfly. So I guess I'll say now that I think this album... Alright, editing Slater here. Rather than me talking about Mr. Morale and The Big Steppers now, I really want to have a series where I go through and explain all of Kendrick's major albums, and then I'm going to end that series with me talking about his full discography, rating all of his albums, and ranking them. So just give me a few on that. I still need more time to think. But anyways, let me know what you thought about this album by Kendrick. Did you enjoy it? Were you satisfied after the long wait after his last album, Damn? And are you ready for the next big wait for his next album after this? Be sure to let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video and you want to support me, please leave a like on this video. Also subscribe to become a part of the Slater Mob, aka JayDotMafia, and that is a wrap on this video. Until next time, y'all.